Ocean lovers, let's talk about some aquatic biomes. This is topic 1.3. Here we go. We have many different aquatic biomes. You can read all of this. You should know that it is important that you know all of this for the AP exam. So we're expecting you to know the difference between all these different biomes. Now, when we're talking about biomes different from our terrestrial biomes, the main factor for most of this is salinity, how much salt is in the water. Other things we're going to look at are depth, turbidity, nutrients, and temperature. But the most important piece that we need to remember is the salinity, because that's going to change different biomes. Now, when we're talking about terrestrial biomes, most of the time our limiting factors are temperature and precipitation, or water. But we're in the ocean, so we have tons of water. And for the most part, our temperature doesn't really change much. So instead, in our aquatic biomes, our limiting factors are going to be more due to how much sunlight do we have, how much oxygen is there, and then how many nutrients are there as well. Most importantly, again, that salt one. So fresh water is water that has less than 1% salt content. Fun fact, actually all water has a little bit of salt in it. However, we only start tasting that salt when it gets close to 1%. So here we go. We have all of our oceans, 97%, that's a big number, of all the water on this planet is in the oceans. So that means only 3% is fresh water. And out of that 3%, most of it is in ice caps or groundwater. So only 1% of that 3% is even accessible fresh water. And then when we break that down a little bit more, only 8% of it is in rivers. The rest of it is either in water vapor, it's in the soil, or it's water within living organisms. There's very little fresh water that exists in comparison to all the salt water. Now, we have to remind ourselves, as I'm going to throw this in one more time, that we're looking, and when we look at these marine biomes, they're so full of so many different resources. We know that because we fish it all the time. We're constantly pulling resources out of it. But these resources are going to vary based on salinity, the depth, the turbidity, the nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then also the temperature, which is related to light and depth. Okay, so let's talk about these rivers. Rivers and lakes are extremely important for our terrestrial ecosystems. They provide so much drinking water. All of us have seen Lion King. We know they all go to the watering hole. But for everything that needs water, they come to these rivers to access it. In addition, it is a major habitat for fish, waterfowl, and many different insect larvae. Now, for the most part, our rivers are going to start in the mountains. They're sourced from water that's coming off of snowmelt, or from springs, or from alpine lakes. Now, that water is going to flow very quickly in the beginning. So in our upper regions of most rivers, they're running super fast. And because they're moving very fast, it's very difficult for any life to really sustain in those very quick moving, very shallow rivers. Then as we move down to lower regions of the river, they're going to be moving a lot slower, and often they're going to flow underneath canopies of trees. So what happens is our beautiful tree here, it has its leaves fall into the river, and that provides nutrients. So when we have these more shallow, slower rivers, we're able to get a lot more nutrients and therefore sustain a lot more life. Now, if you look at this, the color of this river here, you notice it's really, we call this dark. It's very almost opaque, and you can't see through it. So this does become an issue. There's not as much photosynthesis that can enter this water. So eventually we get to a point where we have all these nutrients, but because there's not a lot of photosynthesis that's happening, not a lot of life can be sustained when we have these super dark, kind of milky rivers. Eventually, though, they will get to the sea. All right, let's talk about wetlands. These are super, super important. Wetlands are areas that are covered by water for at least part of the year. They are so nutrient rich, almost as nutrient rich as a rainforest, so which is why we really need to protect them. They're extremely shallow, and because they're super shallow, all this light can come in, allowing for tons and tons and tons of photosynthesis. If you notice, we also have all these areas inside of our wetlands which provide great habitat. So not only is it extremely nutrient rich, but it also provides great security in habitats. One of the most productive biomes that we're going to look at, just as productive as rainforests. All right, now let's talk about estuaries. Estuaries are the coastal regions where the river meets the ocean. So here we have a river, here we have ocean, and so we are talking about this space where the two of them come together. Now, rivers are bringing down a ton of nutrients. All of those decomposing leaves, everywhere they have traveled, so many nutrients that they are bringing down. Now, when this mud, because as we saw before, it's a very muddy river up top, but when this mud hits the salt water, it flocculates, which means that it kind of clumps together and sinks to the bottom. And when it flocculates, it really clears up the water, allowing for so much more photosynthesis to happen in this area. So this is, again, another area that has a primary productivity that is very similar to rainforests because of all the nutrients that are meeting now this clear water, allowing for lots of photosynthesis. So they're extremely important biomes, not just because of the food and the species that are allowing to grow there, but they provide a lot of shelter, especially for some very juvenile oceanic fish that are fueling up on all those nutrients there, and tons of bird species. Now, most estuaries, we're going to put them into two categories. Number one here, this is a salt marsh. And number two here, this is a mangrove forest. We normally find the mangroves in more tropical areas, and both of these are going to trap so much sediment. If you notice, let me get my little pointer going on here. If you notice all of this area, these little like islands that exist, and all the roots in our mangroves, this is tons of area to trap sediment. And when they trap that sediment, they're going to get tons of nutrients that come with it. And because they're very shallow, we're going to have lots of photosynthesis. So all these plants trapping the nutrients, thriving off of those nutrients, and creating a very rich biome. Okay, let's talk about salt marshes in a little bit more detail. So they're going to be in very shallow water. And normally behind barrier islands, we can't have a lot of like turbid flow. The main source of this productivity in the salt marshes are these things called Spartina grass, which is what you see all throughout here. These little islands of Spartina grass. That Spartina grass is gonna provide food and habitat for a ton of different invertebrates, waterfowl, insects, reptiles. All these little islands are creating, as I mentioned before, habitats for tons of different species. Now, looking at mangroves, all of their spiny little, we call these nodules that are coming out these roots here. These are also able to trap tons of sediments. So holding the tree above them, creating these really safe areas inside of here, tons of protection. And actually what happens on these nodules is they're able to shed the salt. So all the salt water that comes in, they can kind of extract that salt out. Pretty cool chemistry happening there. Now, as I mentioned before, they're great for protection. So if you look at this here, especially for juvenile fish, you have all these little protective spots where they can hide and just thrive on this biome. So fantastic biome that's extremely productive as it provides both nutrients and a safe habitat. All right, let's talk about some coral reefs. This is my favorite of all the aquatic biomes. Coral reefs are found, they're near the shore of marine areas, but we call them kind of offshore. And it needs to be in very tropical seas and areas that are very free of sediment. This is very important. So not a lot of sediment. They need that clarity so that the sun can penetrate in and provide so much photosynthesis. So though we think these guys are plants here, these corals are actually animals. They're kind of like jellyfish attached to a calcium carbonate skeleton. And they provide protection as well. So you have so much protection happening in here. We also have algae in coral reefs that are often found in these structures here that are one of the main producers in the coral reef biome. Now, as I mentioned before, corals are actually an invertebrate. They're not plants, and they form this skeleton of calcium carbonate. Then they have this symbiotic relationship with algae that are going to live inside the coral polyps. And those corals, they're going to eat the zooplankton. This, as I mentioned before, provides a massive habitat and structure and protection for so many different marine fish and invertebrates. Now we're going to talk about the photic zone. Photic here is another word for light. So this is kind of the upper 200 meters of the ocean where light is able to penetrate. So we're able to get light into this water. It's important because phytoplankton, algae, and protists, they're the main producing organisms in the ocean. So provide all this energy and form the base of our marine food web. But they need to have light. So they can only live in these upper 200 meters of the ocean. Below that photic zone, we have the aphotic zone, which would be no light. It's also called the abyssal or deep zones. Even though we have no photosynthesis going on here, we have a lot of dead organisms that are going to sink from above. So we have these crazy vast reservoirs of nutrients that unfortunately are not available. Now, sometimes we do have upwelling that occurs, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, and it creates this mass supply of nutrients. So if this dead matter on the bottom of the ocean can ever be brought up and mix that with oxygen, because we don't have a lot of oxygen down here either, and mix it with photosynthesis, we create an incredible area of nutrients that becomes extremely prolific. And as we mentioned, there's no photosynthesis in the aphotic or abyssal zone. We still have productivity, and it's due to what we call vent life. So vent life talks about how we have these volcanic vents. This is an example of some of these volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean, especially by the mid-ocean ridges. And these vents release certain chemicals. And we've actually found that there are bacteria that can extract energy using those chemicals. It's a process here called chemosynthesis. So they're going to take in those chemicals and they're going to use that for energy. Incredible, unique species down here that are able to do this. Now, just as a reminder, in terrestrial biomes, our plants account for 1,000 times as much biomass as animals. However, when we go to marine biomes, animals actually account for 30 times more than plants. We talked about this in another video where we were talking about the pyramids, the energy pyramids, and how because we have so many single cell plants in the aquatic and in the marine biomes, they're so quickly eaten. We don't have trees that stick around for 500 years. And so because of that, we have a lot more mass in our animals in the marine biomes than we do with our plants. Total biomass on Earth is 550 billion tons. Unfortunately, of this, only 10 billion is in the marine biomes. All right, that's a wrap. Thanks, y'all.